Hi, Lisa. So happy to have you today. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad
That's
to be here.
good. Well, before we get started, we're going to talk all things menstrual cycle today, which is exciting, but I wanted to just get a little bit of your background for the listeners to hear about how you got to where you are today.
Well, so I discovered fertility awareness when I was very, very young. I would say about 19 years old, and it was kind of like my first year of university. And so it was a really interesting period of time. I had had really heavy, painful periods. And so I was put on the pill early because of that reason. So I always had it in the back of my mind that, I don't know, I had it in the back of my mind for whatever reason that I didn't think it was normal for it to be that way, and I didn't want to be on the pill forever. So I discovered fertility awareness, and I learned that you're only fertile for a short window of time each cycle. And that really appealed to me. So I wanted to come off the pill anyways to kind of see what my cycles were like and see if I could find other ways to manage the pain. And so that was the beginning of the rabbit hole for me. I ended up finding a group on campus that were teaching, and I took a course and I started, with a group of women, we were teaching women to do it. It was at a very grassroots type kind of volunteer based level. So I never really thought I would be able to make a career out of it. But fast forward to when I had my first, child, I had my son. And it was about that time that I realized how I had been able to take for granted this information for basically a decade of my life. And the average woman still has no idea how her cycle works. And, so many women struggle with infertility. And that really prompted me to start my podcast, client work, and ultimately to write my book and do all of the interesting things that I've done since then.
Well, that's great. And it is so important. And women are becoming much more aware of our cycles and talking about it. I love that the conversations are happening now because I think for a lot of years, it was just like, oh, not something we talk about. So it's great that we are talking about it, opening the conversation up and really getting people more aware. So let's just start to talk about what a normal, healthy menstrual cycle actually looks like.
Yeah, I mean, when I get that question often when I'm asked, the kind of background is like your period only. So when I talk about what a healthy menstrual cycle looks like, I'm talking about the whole thing. So from the first day of your period until the last day before your next one. So we can start with the period. I mean, in a healthy cycle, the period lasts anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. The average is about 5 days. We would expect to have the bleeding kind of have a beginning, middle, and an end, and then it be over, typically starting moderate to heavy and then kind of decrescendoing down to light and very light. And so, in a healthy cycle, the bleeding is happening during your period. So you're not bleeding all throughout your cycle. It is quite common for women to have a few days of spotting before their period or a couple days of spotting after. But typically, we just want to be aware that the spotting before the period, though really common, is not necessarily optimal. A couple more things about the period. It shouldn't be extremely painful. So moderate to severe pain, although very common, is not optimal and is a sign that there's an issue, whether it's inflammation or potentially a more serious issue like endometriosis if the pain is really severe or something like that. And there's such a thing as too light of a period and too heavy of a period. So the volume should fall somewhere between about 25 to 80 milliliters or, about 3 to 4 ounces or so, depending on where you live. And so that's just the period part, which I think is interesting because even that piece of information that I just shared, many of us have no idea, even the concept of what normal volume would be like. And, even to think about that, a lot of women who have really heavy periods may not be aware that they're really heavy. And other women who barely have a period who bleed for like a day or two might not be aware that that's like our society would say, oh, it's so, you're so lucky. So they might not be aware that that could be a problem also. But when we move past the period, in a healthy cycle, we would expect the overall length to be somewhere between about 24 and 35 days, with an average of about 29 days. So, everybody's period is not 28 days, but having a period that varies a little bit, whether let's say one cycle it's 27 days and the next cycle is 32 days, that's not necessarily a problem. I've spoken to many women who think their cycles are irregular if it's, sometimes 31 days. But what would actually be an irregular period would be if the cycles were varying more than about 8 days from cycle to cycle, or if you're having fewer than about 8 periods a year. So it's also helpful to be aware of that definition. But the length is not everything. And so, moving further into this, we can divide the cycle into two halves. So we have before ovulation, after, so the pre and post ovulatory phase. So once your period is done in a healthy cycle, we would expect to see a few days in the fertility awareness world, we call those dry days. So a few days before we start to see your cervical fluid. Cervical fluid can look like creamy white hand lotion. It can look like clear, stretchy egg whites. And so once, you're getting into that pre-ovulatory phase in a healthy cycle, we would expect to see about 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid leading up to ovulation, with at least 1 day of the clear, stretchy stuff. So again, looking kind of like the raw egg whites. And so that's what we're producing as we approach ovulation. It plays this really interesting role in keeping the sperm alive and all that good stuff. And in a healthy cycle, we would then ovulate. So ovulation is key to having a healthy cycle. And in order for that cycle to fall between that range, the 24 to 35 days, ovulation has to take place somewhere between days about 10 and 22 or so. Otherwise, the cycle is either going to be too short or too long, kind of thing. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then once you ovulate in a healthy cycle, the cervical fluid would dry up, and we would expect your period to come about 12 to 14 days later. So the second half of the cycle in a healthy cycle has to be about 12 to 14 days long. That shows us that we have good progesterone production, and that's what's necessary if you were, trying to conceive or to have a baby, to actually have that progesterone be strong enough and the luteal phase to be long enough to allow implantation to happen. But if you're not trying to get pregnant, it's also good to have strong progesterone production so that you have balanced hormones and don't have severe PMS symptoms. So, that's a whole lot of information that many women haven't heard before, because usually when you think about, well, what's a healthy cycle? It's like, oh, it's just 28 days and and that's it. That's all we hear.
Yeah. So getting the variations, I know even you're right, the amount, like people aren't thinking about how much they're bleeding or how that's impacting the whole cycle too. And knowing how, I think the follicular phase is that first phase, and then we have the luteal phase. People are starting to become aware that this is a whole cycle of through the menstrual phase. And really, I hear you also use the term vital sign. So what vital sign would you consider during a menstrual cycle?
Well, so I use the word vital sign to imply that the menstrual cycle itself is the fifth vital sign. And so the more common vital signs that we're familiar with would be like our heart rate or our respiratory rate, our body temperature, those types of things, our blood pressure. And so a vital sign is simply a measure of how our body's functioning. And if you were to go to your doctor and they take your vitals, it gives them specific information about how you're doing right now. If one of the vital signs is off, like if you have high blood pressure, not only does it tell them that there's a problem, but it also tells them what possible things could cause it, because we know that there's certain things that cause high blood pressure or certain things that cause an elevated body temperature. And so with the menstrual cycle, all of those things that I just described would make up the normal menstrual cycle parameters. And so if we consider the menstrual cycle as a vital sign, then if some of those parameters are off, like if the cycle's 50 days instead of falling into that normal range, or if your period is, 300 milliliters instead of 80, not only does it tell us that something's wrong, but someone who is trained in, cycle interpretation, that type of field, would be able to then also tell you, okay, well, there's certain things that could cause this problem to happen with your cycle. And so in the same way, other vital signs can be used to identify health issues. The menstrual cycle can also be used to do so.
That's great. We're not considering that. We're not looking at our cycle as an overall. I guess even now, whenever we're looking at our cycle, we're more aware of the symptoms, but we're not necessarily really equating that to our overall health. So that's a good point when you're looking at it as a whole health picture. And I do think something else you said that is really key for everyone that's listening is that your normal isn't always normal. So I think that with menstrual cycles, that's something that we do see regular, because that's just what you've experienced. You can think, well, it's normal for me not to get a period for 8 weeks, or it's normal for me to have heavy bleeding or cramping or PMS or all of these things, but you don't have to. So even if that's been your typical cycle, it's not something that you have to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of common but not normal, especially when it comes to menstrual cycle issues, because so much of our menstrual cycle issues have been normalized by our culture. Like, oh, it's totally normal to have Dragon Week and to be like a hot bitch for, 5 days before your period comes. And we all laugh and think it's funny. And, maybe it is funny, but it still normalizes this hormonal imbalance and pretty severe symptomology every single time we have our period, when who's telling us that although that's very common, it's not normal. Who's telling us that if we actually look at the research, women that have moderate to severe PMS also have a sharp decline in their progesterone during that week before their period. So it's actually congruent with this, problematic hormone profile that can actually be improved if we focus on our overall hormonal health. Who's telling us that it's not normal to have ridiculous gushing bleeding? And even women who go to their doctors for period problems. I mean, if anyone is listening who's had that issue, or any period related issue, to be frank, what they're often told is to go on the pill or to take painkillers or something. They're not necessarily told that this could be a sign of an underlying issue and they should look at it. I've had clients who have symptoms of things that could be really problematic, like really, really heavy bleeding, concerning clotting and things like that. And they have to specifically ask, demand, advocate for even an ultrasound. Just, why wouldn't that be the standard, right? But this is just how, unfortunately, it often is for women's reproductive issues.
Yeah, I think just in general, the whole medical model today is the band-aid approach. And so we're often looking at, the first line is what medication can we use to treat this symptom, not what can we do to look at why the symptom is happening. And so that's a kind of a common thing I run into, whether it is, menstrual health, or whether it's headaches or even gut issues or all these things. We're looking at what can, even on immunity, what can we do to treat that symptom, versus looking when we actually dig in and we find out the imbalances, we can go and just simply fix the imbalances, and then you don't have to deal with it. So it's not like, oh, we need that medication that causes other side effects to deal with it. We actually don't have it anymore, which is always a much better thing for all of us. Yes. So
Yeah.
one of
Well,
the things, yeah, oh, you go.
oh, it just made me think about when you said, like, and you don't even have to have it anymore. I think for a lot of women, it's like you can't even imagine to not have the period pain or the, PMS symptoms or whatever, because you've always had them. Just like what you were saying, like, this is just because it's your normal doesn't mean it's normal.
Yeah, and that's actually another to add to that, because these are things people can start at a young age. And I think another thing that people were told is like, oh, you're young, you don't have problems. Oh, you're young, so you're healthy, so it's just the way it is. And so people feel like, well, that wasn't, I was young when I had it. It's been going on forever. I was healthy. But that is, your body's telling you a sign of imbalance. So I think that's another thing I hate to see people be told, is like, oh, well, you're young, you're healthy, just like live with it.
Yeah, I mean, to take on that, because I focus on the menstrual cycle is an objective kind of marker in my world, anyways, my industry. And it can be off regardless of your physical appearance. So I think another challenge for women in particular is if you are young, relatively healthy looking, also if you're slim, then it's kind of like one of those things where if you look good, if you look right, like if you have that feature, if you have those features and you stroll in to the doctor's office, they're kind of like, well, you couldn't possibly have any problems. Meanwhile, their menstrual cycle could be screaming out, like maybe you're not even getting a period, maybe you're getting 4 periods a year, but if you look a certain way, it's hard for you to get support. And I've been doing a bunch of research into PCOS in the last couple of weeks and feeling really frustrated by, I found a study where they were looking at the doctors, and these were not just even right, like these were reproductive endocrinologists. So they did a study on an OBGYN, like these were the doctors that are supposed to have the answers. And there was a very clear pattern where if the women looked slim, and even if they had the symptoms, they were much less likely to be identified, diagnosed, and supported.
Wow, that is a shame. I mean, that's something that we don't want to hear, you don't want to be reading studies like that and it is putting people in a box because, and that's, I guess I always tell people, trust your intuition. If something's off, you can feel it. You are ready to seek help, and you just need to advocate for yourself to get the help you need sometimes in order to get the right testing or get the right, information in order to help you. So one of the things I heard you bring up is progesterone. And that is also something that I see very commonly is low progesterone in women with period problems. Do you want to get into a little bit of that?
Sure. I mean, when you're charting your cycles, so I'm sure your audience is at least somewhat familiar with that. But, with fertility awareness tracking, you're usually tracking whether it's your basal body temperature, so taking your temperature in the morning, whether it's tracking your cervical fluid, you're tracking when your periods are coming. And as I mentioned, you're tracking that overall cycle. So you can see the pre-ovulatory, follicular phase versus the post-ovulatory luteal phase. So when you start tracking your cycle, it becomes very apparent very easily to see, if your luteal phase, if that second half of the cycle is normal. So it's very common then for women who start tracking to start to see what's really going on. And luteal phase issues are quite common. I think that I think that it can be surprising how common that they are. And it's interesting because I feel like low progesterone as a topic has become this huge thing. Everyone's talking about low progesterone and as if it's like a disease in and of itself. I find it to be very, very interesting. But when you're tracking your cycle, you're going to see it. So why is it so common? We could have a discussion about why. I have my thoughts, and I think that a part of it is the kind of mismatch to our modern world and to our bodies. I think that there's a lot of general stress that we're under all the time. I think that when I am supporting clients to improve progesterone, and the irony is that I think that it's actually quite straightforward in many ways to improve progesterone. That's why I kind of find it interesting that it's talked about in this way, like it's this big disease, because it's not, in my world, it's actually not that mysterious.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's hard for people.
So
The big stress word. I feel like I'm always talking about stress, and while it's simple, it's sometimes hard for people in life to do, but we're always talking about just managing. Even if you can't change your environment, you can manage your response to stress because your body's ultimately reacting to your response. And so really working on some of those things. For people that don't know, the cortisol is a more predominant hormone than progesterone, and they share a pathway. So whenever we get the high levels of cortisol, we start to see this tank of progesterone, and really going back to bringing your body back in the parasympathetic nervous system can be so helpful.
Yes, definitely. And with progesterone issues, I found, I take my clients through the foundational factors first. I refer to it that way because often we want it to be this, I think a lot of women, when they start charting and they start to see things that look weird, it's like, oh, I must have, like, I looked it up on the internet, I must have this disease that I can't pronounce. And it's like, we kind of want it to be exciting, but often it starts with getting enough sleep. I know that's boring, but that's what it is. There's actually research to show that if you don't get enough sleep, or if you're not sleeping in the dark, that disrupts your melatonin, which then disrupts your progesterone. So there are women who literally, just by sleeping well and making their room dark, they can gain a day or two on their luteal phase. So that's something we need to look at. And I would say a huge role, a huge factor in progesterone issues is diet, making sure you're getting enough food, exercise, making sure you're consuming enough for your activity level. I work with a lot of women who are really active, and they're, working out 4 or 5 times a week, and often under eating inadvertently. And that will give you a shorter luteal phase. If you wanted to try to get issues with your luteal, a shorter luteal or premenstrual spotting, working out 7 days a week without eating enough is how you would do it. Like that would be the easiest way to do that. So I guess my point is that there's a lot of kind of basic things that we may be doing that we are not aware of, are even related to our cycle, that can have this profound effect. So a lot of those issues can be addressed by addressing some of these basic factors first, before even going to different supplements and things like that. And of course, The stress part is huge, but often I find that stressful events lead us to not eat and not sleep. So I think it's all related.
Yes, yeah, I agree. No, I agree. It's cyclical, and we're doing things often that we're taught to do or want to do to get certain outcomes that are actually creating more of this dynamic. What other common things do you have, health conditions do you see that are affecting the menstrual cycle?
Well, I mean, I just touched on polycystic ovary syndrome, so PCOS, and that's characterized by long irregular cycles and metabolic issues like insulin resistance and um, glucose intolerance and high androgen levels. So that's something that for me, it's quite obvious, when a person has a kind of classic PCOS presentation in their cycle because their cycles are really long, because their cycles are, 40. So they are cycling. It's not like they're not cycling, but it just takes them forever to ovulate. So you have these kind of long, irregular cycles, lots of cervical mucus, often multiple patches of it. And one of the biggest challenges for those clients is to get their cycle down to that kind of 24 to 35 day range. So that's something I do see. Also, I would say HA, like hypothalamic amenorrhea, but the way I mostly see clients who are actually cycling. They come to me when they have a cycle, but what I often see is kind of similar to that, what we were talking about, like that I would say they're on the HA spectrum where they are inadvertently under eating or over exercising, and they still have cycles, but maybe they're seeing like low mucus patterns, or they're seeing kind of disrupted cycle issues, but they're still cycling. So that's been something I see a lot lately. And I think maybe it's because there's such a focus in our world right now on health and nutrition, and everyone's trying to get it right. But a lot of it for women is to try to get their body looking a certain way. So I think that it amounts to a lot of trying to eat less and exercise more so that we can lose weight. And that plays out in the cycle in different ways. I also, because of the field and, a large portion of women who use fertility awareness are trying to conceive, I do see women who are trying to conceive and struggling with different issues around fertility. And ironically, with fertility awareness charting, because you can see when the sex is happening, if it's being timed correctly, etc., it often allows us to highlight when there's an issue with the male and his sperm quality. So that's something interesting. I mean, I could go on, but those are the things that come to mind right away, because those do make up I see a lot of progesterone related things, but like I said, it kind of falls into often the same category. And there's other issues obviously that present as well, thyroid issues, gut issues, those types of issues show up in the cycle in different ways as well. But often a lot of the improvement that we can get in the cycle is by dealing with the kind of big rocks first, and then far fewer of those issues left after we've done that are then related to these other health conditions, which is interesting. But
Yeah, that is very, yeah. Well, let's shift gears here a little bit and talk about hormonal contraceptives, because that's the other side of the of the ballpark. So, we now know all the effects of hormonal birth control, and really sometimes I think one of the things that I see, which you probably see in the people that you're working with, is that they're just given first line right away for a wide variety of things, and even just like, oh, well, you're a certain age, you should just use them. And so we're seeing all of these nutrient deficiencies and all of these other things happening from long-term use of hormonal birth control pills. So do you want to get a little bit into excuse me, let me just try. Do you want to get a little bit into I'm sorry, I'm just going to cut that, Tim. Do you want to get a little bit more into how you're seeing that effects of hormonal birth control use?
yeah, so the way that it kind of shows up in my practice is when I'm working with women who are coming off birth control for whatever their goals are. So some of them are coming off birth control just because they're wanting to improve their hormonal health. Maybe they've been on it for a really long time. They've just discovered the birth control aspect of fertility awareness. And so many of my clients are actively trying to prevent pregnancy, but maybe they want to conceive in a few years. And so they want to kind of see what's going on with their cycles. And of course, I also work with women who are coming off of birth control to conceive, right away. So what I tend to see, as you mentioned, there is an interesting trend. It's more rare to see clients who've never been on birth control. The numbers are like 100 million women worldwide, like 80% or more of women who, have used hormonal contraceptives at some point. So the majority of us, including myself, have used contraceptives at one time or another. I find it interesting that in the research, often they're looking at, 3-month terms and 2 years is considered long term. When, my clients have typically used hormonal contraceptives for an average of, I would say, 8 to 12 years, because I have clients who've used it for, 2 years, 5 years, but that's not common. It's more common is 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So some of the ways that the pill affects the cycle specifically, I mean, I could talk about side effects up and down, but how I see it in my practice is when women come off the pill, one of the things that can happen is there can be a temporary delay in the return of fertility, so particularly ovulation. And it doesn't happen for everybody, but some women come off the pill and they start ovulating again right away. And some women, their cycles are actually fairly regular afterwards, regardless of how long they've taken it. But other women come off, and some of them fall into the category where their ovulation doesn't return for a while. So they might be looking at 3, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, where it doesn't return at all. And then when it returns, their cycles are irregular for a while. And there's a small percentage of women, so it's not that common for women to come off the pill and just not get their period at all. But there is a small percentage of women for whom that is happening. The interesting piece of that is that the pill doesn't cause that necessarily. It's a different way of looking at it. So if a person has an issue with their cycle, so let's say that they were a teenager and their cycles were irregular and they were put on the pill because their cycles were irregular, right, to quote, regulate their cycle. So the pill doesn't regulate your cycle. The pill shuts down ovulation and gives you a regular withdrawal bleed. So your ovaries are not actually doing anything. So you could call it a period, and they do, but it's a withdrawal bleed. The reason it's called a withdrawal bleed is because you're withdrawing the artificial hormones, and as a result, you have a bleed. Whereas a true menstrual period would be a result of you ovulating and then having a luteal phase and then having a natural period at the end. So I'm just putting in that distinction there. So if you have that teenager, who had this irregular cycle and she's put on the pill doesn't regulate it. So it's like putting a Band-Aid on. So I use interesting analogies to describe this. One of the analogies is like if you have like a grease fire in your kitchen, and instead of, putting it out, you just like shut off the alarm so it stops blaring. So that's kind of the analogy there, where if you had this underlying problem that's causing your cycles to be irregular, because again, we're, from my perspective, looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And so if the cycles are irregular, it's not just this random thing that's separate from everything else. It means that there's a problem in your body regarding your overall health that needs to be addressed. So then you take the pill for 10 years and come off. Well, we didn't fix the problem. So when you come off, then you're more likely, the women who had those cycle problems when they went on the pill are more likely to experience this delay in the return of their fertility, because many of these women did have an underlying issue that was never addressed. So when you come off the pill, it reveals what was really going on, So I'm not saying this to scare people. It's just a fact. Whereas other women who did not go, a lot of my clients who just went on the pill for birth control, so they didn't have any issues with their cycle. Their cycles were pretty normal. Particularly clients who did not go on birth control when they were 12, 13, where they actually had normal cycles for a while and then they started having sex. Maybe they went on the pill at like 18 or whatever. Those women often come off the pill and just cycle normally. So, I mean, I'll stop it there because I could talk about the pill for like an hour and a half. But that's kind of, I suppose, one thing to know. And I guess just to wrap it up, a couple of the common things that women will see in their cycle, in addition to this kind of question of when it's going to return, would be irregular cervical fluid patterns. So I have a number of clients who maybe they just don't see as much, they have fewer days of cervical fluid, or when they do see it, it's more scant for a period of time. Also that kind of cycle irregularity for the first few months, as well as shortened luteal phase and things like that. So there's this period of time that I would call the post-pill transition phase, and that lasts anywhere from 9 to 12 cycles post pill. And so during that time, we're often seeing some of those, it's, in that transition, those cycle irregularities until your hormones kind of get back to normal.
So fertility is your specialty. So what would you say, and you may not be able to say this, but I'm interested in, what would you say the average for women getting off the pill to be able to really focus on conceiving would be? Because I know there is that transition. You can't just jump off the pill, like you're saying, and just go into like, okay, I think I can conceive next month. Generally, there is a transition. Where do you see that generally lie?
Well, so that's an interesting question because, again, some women do come off the pill and get pregnant. Some women get pregnant on the pill.
Yeah, you're right. That's true. You are. That's a good point.
Yeah. So, I think there's different ways to look at it. Like, I'll take you through kind of my thought process. So there's different studies on this also. So it's not even just me talking about anecdotal. There was a really interesting study that looked at the time to conception off of all of these different types of contraceptions. Well, different for variations of the same thing as far as I'm concerned, but the pill versus the IUD versus the shot, versus condoms. And what they found was that when a couple was using condoms, so non-hormonal methods, the average time to conception was about 4 months from when they stopped using the condoms. Women who were using the pill, so the combined oral contraceptive, like the synthetic estrogens and progestins, it took about 8 months. So it took twice the time on average. And I always point out this is an average. So that means some women conceived earlier, but then others conceived later. So that's something to keep in mind too. And then the shot had the longest time to conception, and that was 15 to 18 months, depending on if you were looking at long or short-term use. So this is an important piece. Like, this is where I kind of get on my soapbox and try to when it's interesting in the research, because if you read studies and they talk about it, they really minimize this result. A lot of the studies will look at the 1 year conception rate and they'll just say, well, 85% of the women conceived in a year, so it's all fine. Keeping in mind that any woman that had issues with their cycles before is excluded from the study. So we're not looking at the women who were put on the pill for period problems, which is a lot of women. And they're just saying, oh, in a year, they all get pregnant, it's fine. But what they're not actually looking at is the experience of a woman. So in my world, if you were told your whole life that you had to do everything you could to prevent pregnancy and your partner just has to look at you, and you could get pregnant, then in your mind, you think that the minute you come off the pill, you're going to be pregnant. You know what I mean? Like, you're scared that you might be pregnant now, So what happens is that first month goes by and you're not pregnant and it's like, okay, fine, whatever. But by month 2, month 3, you have someone who's already stressing out. By the time they get to month 8 and month 9 and month 10, a lot of these women are already fully, doing testing and potentially even starting fertility treatments like IUI and a variety of different things that could lead to fertility treatments. So as women, we're not informed about this transition phase. We're not necessarily aware that our bodies kind of shift during this time. And these kinds of things are minimized. So my suggestion is to inform yourself. I do think that to answer your question, if you know that you are wanting to conceive in the near future, and you have the ability to take some time ahead of time, I think that's ideal. And I would recommend, I would say 6 months to a year would be the minimum, but I tend to kind of say 18 months to 2 years if you had problems with your cycle. Like, if you were put on the pill because you had problems with your cycle, then ideally you would give yourself more time, because what happens if you come off the pill and it takes 4 months for it might not happen. It doesn't happen to everybody, but you just don't know which camp you're going to fall into. So again, this is not me trying to fearmonger, because that's how it's twisted. When people talk about this stuff, it's like, oh, she's trying to scare everybody. No, I'm not. I'm trying to tell you that some women come off the pill and they don't actually get their period back right away. And some women, it takes them several months before everything normalizes. And some women just take longer to conceive after they've come off the pill. And that could have to do with all kinds of things. Maybe it has to do with the fact that the pill depletes folate and reduces your B12 and other B vitamins and zinc and all of that. And maybe it just takes you a bit bit of time to sort that out. Or maybe your partner's sperm isn't perfect, and so it takes longer anyways for you. Who knows? But at the end of the day, I obviously feel strongly about the fact that we should have more information, be informed, so that we can take more time if we need to prepare.
I think that those are all great points. I agree. And that is really interesting. The way you put it, that we're told all our life, like, be careful, you can just get pregnant so easily. So that expectation, along with the physiology of what's going on, can create the perfect storm for disappointment, which, like, then we're talking about, then can increase stress, it can increase a decrease in production, and then all sorts of things. So it just compounds each other in this problem. Well, thank you so much. You've provided so much helpful information to our listeners. Can you tell everybody where they can find you?
Yes, absolutely. So let me think of the places. So the social media place where I hang out the most is Instagram at Fertility Friday. If this topic interests you, I go into the weeds in the and the research and everything in my book, The Fifth Vital Sign, and you can download the first chapter for free over at thefifthvitalsignbook.com. Fertility Friday is my website. That's where I'm at everywhere, fertilityfriday.com. And if you like podcasts, if you just type in Fertility Friday on your favorite podcast player, you'll find I think we're on like episode 450 or something like that. So there's a lot of listening to do if you are into this topic.
Great. They can dive right in. That's good. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.